Hi, this is Matt, and you're listening to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back. This is part 2 of the Clarence White tribute episode. If you didn't hear part 1, go back and have a listen. That has David Grier and Alan Munde in it, and that was, a couple of fascinating conversations about Clarence from people who knew him and played music with him. And part 2 is 4 more interviews that I put together for this, and we're going to chat first off to Russ Barenberg, who one of my favourite guitarists, but was very inspired by Clarence and did a transcription of some of his stuff for a book. Just really interesting interview with Russ. And then I'm going to talk to Diane Bouska, who was Roland White's wife. She spent a lot of time with Roland, transcribing both Roland's music and also working in a lot of detail on the book of transcriptions of Clarence's that came out. And she's going to chat about that, and that was really interesting, along with some lovely personal insight from Diane. That was a lovely conversation to have. Followed by a chat with Michael Daves, who is always interesting about pretty much anything to do with acoustic music. Talking about the influence Clarence had on him and just how special Clarence was. And finishing off with a chat with Tim Stafford about Clarence. And obviously, Clarence was a huge influence on Tony, and Tim knows a lot about Tony. And it's always a joy to talk to Tim. So this is what you've got coming up in this episode. We're going to kick off with my chat with Russ Barenberg. The first time I'd spoken to Russ, which was a real treat for me. Here comes Russ Barenberg.
I first heard him when I was just, probably just 6 months or so after I started playing the guitar. And I don't know exactly. I took some lessons from a guy who had sort of gotten into the folk scene back then around 1960. This was like 1964. And Appalachian Swing had just come out. And so I got the record, and it just, it was magic to my ears. At that time, I picked stuff up, from his playing. But, it wasn't until about 10 years or more than 10 years later when I wrote that book that I really started trying to transcribe them exactly. I did pick up a lot just in terms of the general spirit, and I was imitating his solos when I was 14 years old or so. And, Doc Wasson, a lot of people knew about him, and I had already heard him play. But when I heard Clarence, it was clear he, it was like sort of this brand new sound back then, and still is a brand new sound, because nobody plays like him, and nobody plays like anybody else really. Although it is sometimes somewhat common. I think Tony Rice was imitated a lot, and that's really, certain recordings hit you at a certain time, and I think when you're that age, they're like more magical than if I would have heard it later. Although, not to say that diminishes anything about his playing at all, but it was, I just like the energy of it. It's like he's always sort of exploding out of the gate, and of course he was very original and experimental at the time. He developed his own language, and it was clearly something that didn't exist before. And it has a lot to do with the syncopation and just the creativity and invention of the way he played. It was just, he was obviously very young, was deeply into just playing his own way. What really, I think, if anything, what I picked up on was that I just loved how kind of original it was. And that it made me want to just kind of find my own way of playing. Not necessarily be another Clarence White, but definitely aspects of his music and his way of playing affected mine, and still do. But But that was the important thing. It's just, well, this guy is just himself, and he's unique. And
sorry, I was going to say, you mentioned sort of Tony being imitated, and there's a lot of so much bluegrass guitar involves sort of lick-based stuff. And when I first heard Clarence, it was so clear. It was much more sort of centered around the melody, and the improvisation came from playing with the tune and with the rhythm that was there already, more than like putting something else on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he paid attention to the tunes in everything he played, and he was able to improvise doing that. And I think that's something that rubbed off on me too, because the way I play it in that respect is I don't play sort of a riff-based kind of style. It's more how do you express the melody, and in your own way. So yeah, I agree with you, definitely.
And that's one of the things that I first noticed about your playing when I first started listening, particularly with some of the transatlantic session stuff, which is a lot of tunes played. It's this idea that you can improvise by changing the tune a bit, rephrasing something, changing the odd note, putting a different phrase here and there. Whereas I had it in my head at that point that a solo meant you just improvise something over the chord changes. And actually hearing people just slightly turn the melody so you hear it from a different angle is equally as powerful.
I think it's more powerful. It's a matter of really, if you approach soloing as an embellishment of the melody or as a slight reinvention of it, it's actually a stronger and more varied kind of soloing. And I sort of had no choice when I was, developing my own playing, because I didn't feel like I could improvise anything good enough that it satisfied me. So I started out by composing solos when I was put in a situation where I knew I wanted to not just play something I heard Doc Watson play or rehash something. So I just composed things a lot. And after doing that for a while, then I started to get a little more confidence in improvising, because I had developed my skills in terms of hearing and embellishing melodies. I still am sort of feel like I hesitate. Sometimes I'll be soloing and I'll sort of lose my train of thought because I want to go back and make that last thing better. I heard, it should have been this kind of thing. And that compositional part of it is deep in me, for better or for worse. But yeah, I mean, Clarence based his stuff, to a large extent on the melody of the particular song. And I think that leads to a much more varied kind of playing, because the other approach, you're just putting the same stuff over this, the chord changes might be different, but eventually you're just kind of playing the same thing all the time.
Yeah, and you mentioned the syncopation, but also the cross-picking, which is a big feature of Clarence's playing. And if you apply those two things to a melody, you've sort of got infinite scope for improvisation just by changing where the beat falls, or just by stretching a phrase across the bar line.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the cross-picking came, I believe, from kind of wanting to imitate Scruggs-style banjo playing on various instruments. Jesse McReynolds did it on the mandolin, and Clarence did it. And at the time I wrote that book, I had never seen him play, because I never met him, and there weren't videos available of him playing. So I was sort of guessing how he did it. But what I didn't guess, and what I think is true now after seeing some of those videos, is that there's in some cases where I think he was doing it with the pick and two fingers rather than all with the flat. Very much like banjo playing. I could be wrong, but
yeah, and there's a little bit in that video. There's a masterclass on YouTube with Bob Baxter, sort of asking him how he plays, and he does a little bit of that where you hear, because a lot of people, when they do that sort of hybrid picking, it's more to replace finger picking patterns, and it's not playing melodically. It's more about sort of trying to replace But it's interesting because he does use it melodically, doesn't he?
Well, you weave melodies into it. That's kind of what bluegrass banjo is. You know, you hear the melody coming out of bluegrass banjo playing, and likewise out of his guitar playing and out of Jesse McReynolds' mandolin playing. So yeah, it's another way of, and you're right, it naturally throws stuff off the beat and into syncopation, because it's more or less a 3-note pattern over a 4-note rhythm. So it tends to emphasize offbeats.
And it's astonishing, sort of, you talk about the thing that impressed you most was almost how unique a style he had, and he developed, and he was so young when that record was recorded to have sort of formed a musical voice that sort of intriguing and arresting in his teens.
Yeah. Just his way of doing it. It's sort of that's just what came out when he put a guitar in his hand, you know. It's all about curiosity, you know. He just, what can I do with this?
You can sort of hear it. I remember the first time I heard some of those tunes, the sort of 33 fiddle tunes that he recorded, and you just hear him syncopating things, and you can actually hear him playing with the material, like not just playing you the material and making some decisions he's made previously, but you can hear him just going, I wonder how long I could take this pattern on for, or I wonder what happens if I do this, and it's that playfulness that makes it, for me, like, and I didn't hear it obviously back then, but it's what makes it so kind of alive now, you know.
Absolutely. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I agree.
It's the phrase that I think it's a John Hartford phrase about don't just play the music, play with the music. And, you know.
I hadn't heard that one, but yeah, I mean, most good musicians have what's really exciting is discovering things. And you can definitely hear that in his playing, because the excitement was built in. I was having a great time doing it. You can feel it.
Was there anything, when you sort of sat down to transcribe the stuff for the book, was there anything that surprised you when you got into the detail? Was there anything you learned doing that?
Well, I just learned more detail about what he played. Nothing, you know, because I'd listened to it. I'd heard it at that point for a good portion of my life, my young life. And so I was pretty familiar with the sounds. I mean, a lot of that stuff on Appalachian Swing was just etched in my mind, even though I didn't know exactly note by note what he was doing, but it was there. So I wouldn't say that doing the book led to more discoveries, other than understanding a little more thoroughly what he was doing, trying to anyway.
And I think that's one of the sort of saddest things about losing a musician young is always all those questions about where that would have gone and what he would have done later, and there's so few examples for us to sort of dig into compared to a lot of people. That's
true. I mean, he lived to 27, I believe, right? And you know, a lot of times by that age, particularly with people that are really good and creative, that you can hear what they're about. You know, there may be some changes to the specifics of it, but I don't think, you know, you'd recognize him in a similar way, I think, no matter how much further he took it. I could be wrong. I mean, he was already kind of getting away from playing acoustic guitar anyway, for several years before that, when he was mostly playing with the electric, with the Byrds and all that. So I'm not sure how, you know, what would have happened with his acoustic playing or bluegrass playing, or whether he even would have continued playing bluegrass. Who knows?
Yeah, and you hear that sort of the Live in Sweden recording from 73, from not long before he passed. And, you know, I read somewhere that he was slightly nervous about doing that tour because he wasn't sure if he had the chops to do it still after playing electric guitar for so long. Like, what it'd be like to just play like that again. But that's such a good recording.
I hadn't heard that. I don't know where that came from, maybe from Roland. But yeah, I mean, acoustic guitars, it just takes more strength, and, you know, it's a different kind of muscle force of muscle that goes into it. And if you're not doing it for a while, it takes a while to ramp up. I hadn't heard that. Yeah. I mean, for me, the Appalachian swing was it. Everything is there. I hear all these, these surface tapes since then, and yeah, they sound good, but they're not recorded as well, and they're him by himself, which is, fun to hear. But I think the most exciting playing is on that record.
And there's something about hearing him respond to other musicians that you don't get when he's playing on his own, because his rhythm playing is also extraordinary, particularly for such a young player.
Yeah. On Appalachian Swing, you can hear he's sort of warming up on his next solo during the rhythm playing. While Roland's playing, he's starting to play really like a solo, almost beneath it. And then you hear him come out and play some of the stuff he just played behind Roland in the solo. So I think it's like he's like, here it comes, boom. He jumps out of the gate like a racehorse.
It's almost like getting the energy built up ready so he can take over warm rather than just jumping in.
It seems like it, yeah. Yeah. That's a cool part of that record, about that particular record.
Yeah, and it is really interesting with that and with the solos, just that sense of he's one of the players that from their lead playing, if you walked into the room and he was playing over nobody backing him up, you would know what the tune was based on the solo he was taking, and that's not always the case. We'll be right back with you just after this. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins. If you're attending the NAMM show in January, stop by the Collings booth to say hello to the team, get hands-on with their selection of customised acoustics and electrics, and check out some exciting new prototypes they're working on for 2024. They'll also have a few of their world-class artists on hand demoing various instruments. And if you can't attend, don't forget to follow their Instagram and Facebook accounts throughout the show for photos, videos, and the latest news. Collings guitars are hand-built from the Sound Up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If one of your 2024 resolutions is to improve as a musician, Peghead Nation is the place to go. They have 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music. Courses cover bluegrass, old time, Irish music and swing, plus lessons dedicated to improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 a month, and you can add more for $10. Try any course free for a month with the promo code JAMALONG. Make 2024 a year of more music at pegheadnation.com.
Yeah, I mean, most of the good musicians I know do that in their own way. I wouldn't say it's not always the case. It's not often the case among amateur players because they all want to kind of improvise before they've really built the correct kind of background to do it well and looking for shortcuts. But I think a lot of good musicians, if they're just sitting down playing a tune, you'd hear the melody.
Next up is my chat with Diane Bouska, who was married to Roland White, spent a lot of time sort of listening to, working on transcribing Roland's playing as well as Clarence's playing, put together a book about Clarence's playing. Really, really lovely chat. We talk about that book in quite a lot of detail. We also chat a bit just about her time around the White family and just some lovely little anecdotes. And, it was a joy getting to chat to Diane. I really enjoyed this one. And thanks so much to her for taking the time to get involved. Here comes Diane Bouska.
I had been transcribing Earl Scruggs, Sonny Osborne, and other banjo players and whatever else, some guitar playing from way back in the 70s. And so in 2000, I made a book of Roland's playing, presenting his approach to playing bluegrass mandolin. And that went really well. And, I was pretty intimately familiar with how Roland played.
Yeah.
And, it just knowing it was out there and, the only book on Clarence's playing was Russ Barenberg's, and it was a great book, but it was hard to get. It wasn't reprinted back then. It hadn't been reprinted until, much more recently. wasn't available. So we just decided to put one out. And for a while, Steve Potier had transcribed a lot of Clarence's playing and written columns on his playing for Flat Pick and Guitar magazine. So he seemed like a person that could definitely help. And Matt Flinner was here locally. Steve is in California, and we're in Nashville, Tennessee. Matt Flinner also lives in Nashville, Tennessee, and he had been, I guess we knew of his abilities to transcribe. He's also a guitar player as well as a great mandolin player. So anyway, I engaged him to transcribe quite a few of those 33 instrumentals that Clarence had made as just a home tape on the Wallensack reel-to-reel tape recorder for his students at the time. And so Matt transcribed a bunch of those. And Roland and Steve talked for over a period of years, but they really didn't ever get started on the project. So I finally got involved in, I was going to publish it, but I thought they could, get the project going and start the transcriptions, all that. And they already had what Matt had done. And so anyway, we sent that to Steve, what Matt had done. And he listened, retranscribed things that he heard differently, and he transcribed some more tunes. And this is happening over a period of years because some things happened in between that didn't allow us to give the full-time attention to it. But, the concept was basically the same as what we had done for Roland's book, which was to put some biography, because I've always enjoyed music instruction books, for instance, jazz guitar books that tell you about the person, the artist that you so admire. You like to know something about their life, and it really makes the teaching more present and personal and intimate when you have the voice of that person, not just their notes on the paper. Pictures help. So we had a lot of great feedback on the one we did about Roland's playing. So kind of employed the same approach. Start out with some biographical information, and in that we basically told the story of the White family coming to Southern California and landing right in the middle of this wonderful burgeoning country music scene. So they just hit it at the time that so much was happening, so many great players there, and there were a lot of live shows and dances, and just a really active and lively music scene and new music being made. And all those performers were really welcoming to the White brothers and sister. Joanne also played and sang with them for a time. So, that story we told more of how they, became professional musicians and started their bluegrass career. And of course, with a focus on Clarence, but, the whole story, I wanted to tell the whole story. So to acquire that, I solicited Roland to write down, whatever memories, stories he could think of. And then I took those notes and interrogated him because, to fill it all out and answer questions. And what about this episode? Didn't you once say that such and such happened? And how did Clarence do this or that? And why did why was his voice so low, and things like that? And just anything, I could think of to fill out the story. So I queried him and acquired more information, and sometimes through research, and put together the biography part of it, trying to maintain the sound of Roland's voice. He didn't write me any whole sentences, but I got the story by interrogation and saying, now, isn't this how it would be? And he would say yes or no, and then we go from there. So we put that together. I put it together with pictures and laid it all out. And meanwhile, I got transcriptions and some commentary back from Steve And I was listening. I had resolved that he would be the expert on the guitar stuff because, although I do a little flat picking, or I had been, I don't really anymore, but I was never, good enough to do it with people in a band or anything like that. I just, for jamming or for my own pleasure, played a little flat picking guitar, but, do not consider myself an authority. And so Steve transcribed or retranscribed some of Matt's stuff and added to it. And a lot of Matt's original transcription is there intact as well.
And I really, that point about the biographical stuff, I find that really interesting because not only is it about who the person was, it's also about where in their life and their career they were at that point. And
exactly. And the scene, I mean, that's an unindicted co-conspirator in the whole story because, that they, the fact that they landed where they did enabled so much to happen, and there was so much music for them to hear and learn. And I did ask Roland, did they ever, like Joe Maphis and Rosalie Maphis took a lot of interest in them and supported them. A lot of those people were very supportive. All the performers on those shows, they were encouraging and supportive of them. And I asked him, did anyone ever, actually show you things on your instrument? And they said, no, you just had to watch, you had to watch and learn carefully. They would, but they never purposely were taught by these folks. They just went and listened to them and hung around and jammed sometimes. So, and I think that's the way it used to be. People didn't teach as explicitly. And one thing that I think is probably true because of that, because there wasn't YouTube or, the easy availability of teachers, you had to have the perception and the memory the first time around. You see somebody and you can memorize what they did. I think we've lost some of our powers of observation and memory. If we watch a person do that, instead of getting it all immediately, we resolve to get a recording of them sometime. Or, I'm going to go home and listen to the record and see what he did. But I think they had a lot better powers of observation, and maybe it had to do with their natural talent as well. But they didn't get taught explicitly. They just, Roland's dad showed them some chords. They had uncles that played the guitar and piano, and aunts, and they showed them, some chords, but nobody really taught them how to play. They seem to have developed that just by observing and listening.
And that's really interesting. Yeah, that skill.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was just going to say that skill of listening is something that really separates sort of exceptional musicians from everybody else. It's not just about what you play; it's about how you play with other people.
Yeah, and in they listen to a lot of radio. They listen to a lot of other types of music. They listened to Mexican music that was coming over the radio, and they had previously listened to all the pop music on the radio when they were in Maine. Their mother collected a lot of country and pop records, and so they were exposed to a broad range of musical styles, and I think they took from all of it. But anyway, back to the book. So the transcriptions, I got them from Steve, and I listened and started following along, and then I thought, wait a minute, I think that slide came from the 3rd fret, not the 2nd fret. It's just little things that I thought I heard. So I went over the whole thing too, and I did make a few changes, which is not to criticize Steve's transcription. I mean, sometimes you just hear things differently, but I gave it all a final, and I transcribed some more sections that I wanted to have in there. I chose the songs because I chose the ones that are public domain and we wouldn't have any trouble publishing, because I had learned previously that it's sometimes hard to get publishers to give you print permission. So we chose all public domain, and some of them are claimed by like, Carter family claimed, A.P. Carter claimed Wildwood Flower, but actually that there's evidence of that song in the 19th century.
And it's really interesting because so much of like bluegrass and old time music, people think that all the tunes are public domain, and so much of it was composed by a particular fiddle player or so it is quite a thorny subject material, isn't it?
Yeah. And, sometimes the copyright has expired, even if it was originally copyright. I think that's the case with Farewell Blues. And that's why you'll see the names of the composers in there, but they've gone to public domain because it was long enough ago that the copyright expired. So I put my final touches on the transcriptions and added some. I used the amazing slow downer, which you got to be careful with slowing things down because it introduces artifacts. I'm sure you know that. You probably had that experience. And then you've got other questions in your mind. Like which string was that played on? Because it sounds thunkier than it did when it wasn't slowed down.
Yeah,
but
totally.
I have had a lot of experience using that, so I know what can happen. And while I was, any questions that I had during the transcription, I would take them to Roland. And I think one benefit, even though I had not transcribed more than one or two of Clarence's songs before, I've had transcribed a lot of Roland's playing, and really their hands work exactly the same. And if you look at their hands, they have a familial hand shape and appearance that all the uncles that I've met and all of Roland's siblings had. It's like they have the same hands. They've got kind of big pods of flesh on the fingertips that are great for fretting like two strings at once if they want. And they're like very straight and kind of slender on the middle of the fingers, but then they have these big fleshy pads on the end. And I was just amazed to see this. We'd visited some of Roland's relatives in Maine, and his uncles, we played guitar with and mandolin with a couple of them, and their hands are just the same, and they work the same. But they use them very economically. So Clarence's hands and Roland's hands, you can watch them playing. They look pretty much the same. Roland told me that Clarence's fingers were just a little bit longer than his. They both had relatively small hands compared to an average man's hand size, I guess. So I did have more of an idea of what might have been done in certain cases, but if I ever had any question, I took it to Roland, and he would usually resolve it pretty well. So that's what we did. I laid the whole thing out and had it printed, chose paper. We recorded backup tracks and had the instrumentals of Clarence's, kind of re-engineered to sound as good as they could, by Ben Surratt. You may know Ben, I don't know.
Yeah.
He's a great recording engineer. I think he's been celebrated in several ways by IBMA. I think he's won Sound Engineer of the Year and so on. A wonderful fellow and a great engineer and so much fun to work with. So he did all the recording at his studio for us, and Missy Raines played bass on our backup tracks. We made guitar, mandolin, and bass backup tracks to play along with and put those on the CDs, which now CDs are kind of obsolete, and I'm working on getting it available as a download so that people don't have to play the CD. I will have that available shortly. The music of Clarence and Roland, it's it's the stuff that matters in the universe. It's Bob Fowler, who was a bluegrass boy, once said to me that the sound of their music, it was love. Basically, it was just love, and he's right. That's what it is. It's the good stuff that everybody wants to connect to. It's that great electric energy. It's full of joy. It's joyful.
And how they play together as well, just listening to
Yes.
that TV workshop that Clarence did. And he's playing some stuff, and then as soon as Roland appears and they're playing together, the whole thing just lifts.
Yeah, the ensemble playing, this is something that a lot of people don't rate on, they don't talk about. But yes, that band, the Kentucky Colonels, their ensemble playing was fantastic. It was just like, they were just like an organism that worked together. And they just did that because they were brothers and they played together forever. Roland was 6 years older than Clarence and 3 years older than Eric. And he was, the ringleader, and bought all the records and bought the band outfits, and worked at the grocery store sacking groceries so he could buy more records and instruments. And their dad bought them instruments too, but Roland led them. And I think the having somebody else be the leader is a great thing for Clarence too, because he didn't have to worry about the business end of anything.
Yeah,
he just played, and he had a pretty ideal setup, but he was very hard working at it too. These guys, it just was in their soul to do it. That's what they wanted to do. That's what mattered. Roland used to ask his dad if he could help him with some of the carpentry projects he was doing, but he said, no, you guys need to keep your hands good for the music. That's what you're going to do. You just practice your music.
Wow. Well, and we all get the benefit of that, because it's totally what you say about the music. The music is always here, and the music is always alive, and it doesn't stop being that. However much time passes, they're still with you. They're still with you, and that's the joy of music. Yeah,
it is. It just makes my eyes water when I talk about it. So I'm sitting here wiping away tears.
That's a beautiful thing. And it's sort of all of that loops back to the beginning when you were talking about the biographical stuff in the book, because it is like music is not separate from who a person is. Music is very much part of who a person is, and their attempt to communicate that to the rest of the world. And there's something just so beautiful about all of that. The person, you can't take the person out of the music.
Yeah, I found that the whole family story interesting. I'm sure they've got some musical genes, because their whole on his dad's side, everybody played music in some way. And, another thing about how they learned to play, it was like woven into family life. It was a social phenomenon. It wasn't a performance-oriented task that they were doing at the beginning. They were doing it it was part of their culture. And it was part of social gatherings, family gatherings. So it served a different function for them in the beginning. It's a more connected to you personally when it's part of your functioning in your social context, your family, and an extended family. They had a large. Roland's father was one of 13 siblings. Actually, wow. Their mother had 17, but 13 made it to adulthood. And so that it was a really large family, and many, many cousins and so on. So that's something that a gift that they had, that was part of their family life, not just, I see this on TV and I want to do it like that guy did so I can be a big shot.
Yeah, I think that's something that runs throughout the bluegrass world. There's so many people who started out playing music with family, and so that connection is much more of an immediate, or it's about going to a jam with your local community. It's not about this far off, disconnected media version of music. Music is part of just the world around you, and so it's a different sort of connection, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so that it's so the ants could dance. We visited Maine in a few times, visited his relatives several times up there, and on the first trip we made about 1990 that he and I made, we played some music and his aunts did dance, and we put a picture of them in the mandolin book. They're dancing to the same tunes that they danced back when Roland and his brothers were kids. It was pretty cool. because I majored in anthropology and psychology, so I had a really big interest in their cultural background coming from, Maine and from French Canadian people ultimately. Now they were all born in Maine, and his mother was born in Maine. Their dad was born in New Brunswick and came into the U.S. And, they never legally changed their name from LeBlanc.
Oh, really?
His name was legally LeBlanc still, but somehow he managed in the early 50s. In the 50s, he got a Social Security card under the name of White. I don't know how you do that. You couldn't do that anymore without the birth certificate backing it up. But so he had two names during his whole life.
Wow. And that was Diane Bouska. My next guest on this episode is Michael Daves, who a great musician, great singer, great teacher, and sort of student, historian, scholar of all things bluegrass. Michael's fascinating. And it's the first time I'd had a chance to properly talk to Michael as well, so that was really cool. I very much enjoyed that, and he's so full of insight and just really interesting to chat to. So here comes Michael Daves. You said something on Instagram about, and I really like the wording of this. You said that Clarence was your main guitar inspiration from when you first heard Appalachian Swing, and it didn't say influence; it said inspiration. And I like
that's
that
right.
Because it's a very that's a meaningful bit of wording.
Yeah. Talk to David Grier about that sometimes. That influence is different than inspiration. No one sounds like Clarence. David has got a lot of that stuff, but David is David, and no one has been able to, I think, replicate the sound and feel that Clarence got, and certainly not me. I avoided even trying for decades, just because I listened to that music and it just seemed so magical. And like the timing, the quirks of timing, and just like there were just subtle things about the delivery that were clear from the get-go that, oh, this is only Clarence. This is, you could kind of copy the notes, but it would never sound like Clarence, because there's something so special about how he delivers what he plays, the touch and especially the timing. So, so I think inspiration is right. I mean, I hear just such, in Clarence, just such sheer musicality and a playful musicality. And so there's a real sense of humor to his playing without being like goofy, but he's a very serious musician and expresses himself very seriously, but with a playfulness that like reminds me almost like, I don't know, like a little bit like Thelonious Monk in jazz. He was a very serious musician, but like, he just like play two notes, dot, 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 almost like he's telling a joke. But it just kind of creates this just kind of openness about music that I think is really special. So I first heard Clarence, I was a teenager. I was probably 15 or 16 and studying with Ray Chesna, who was my guitar teacher in high school. And Ray was from New York and actually had played in had a bluegrass band that included like a 14 or 15-year-old Bela Fleck in New York. But anyways, Ray was a good bluegrass player, but also was really into like fingerstyle, like ragtime. He was kind of a specialist in fingerstyle blues and Piedmont blues particularly. And he got me into a lot of that stuff, like Blind Blake, and also like Western swing, and Charlie Christian, Django Reinhardt. So I mean, Ray presented kind of the whole kind of breadth of American traditional music, and I kind of ended up approaching it somewhat chronologically. So kind of I would go to lesson every week and take home like a pile of CDs or cassettes, and I would dub them all to tape, and that was my listening, because this was the 90s and it was before even like CDRs. But Louis Armstrong, all the way kind of through to like the Stanley Brothers or so. But so I took home Appalachian Swing, and he's like, you need to know about Clarence. He would always give me good music, but like when he gave me the Clarence, there was something, he was indicating that there was something really special about this. And so I kind of listened expecting it to be special, and it really, really was. As far as bluegrass at that point, I had listened to quite a bit of Stanley Brothers and Bill Monroe. I loved the Bill Monroe and Doc Watson recordings, Flatt and Scruggs, like a lot of the classic stuff. But my interests at that time were, I was definitely, as a guitarist, I was really trying to understand what was going on with jazz music and be able to like play over chord changes. And I heard Clarence playing very straight ahead bluegrass, like 9 Pound Hammer, I'm a Pilgrim, in a very like classic bluegrass setting. But he was approaching it with, this inventiveness of phrasing, like in the syncopation and like variations of phrasing that reminded me a lot of Django Reinhardt, Charlie Christian, and like really what I liked about those. Also, he could play over changes, chord changes, which is not something that a lot of bluegrass players take very seriously. Like, I think a lot of bluegrass guitarists tend to be more kind of riff based, lick based players. They'll play blues licks and whatnot. So those things are natural to the guitar. But Clarence was not only very inventive with the phrasing and rhythm, but he really worked with the chord changes. He worked with melodies of the song, and very creatively. You could tell that even when he was playing something that wasn't the melody, that like the melody was still behind it. And so there was something that was very sympathetic to me, by hearing like him and Charlie Christian and Django Reinhardt in particular, and also Bob Wills's guitar players like Junior Barnard and Eldon Shamblin and Tiny Moore on mandolin. So I was just totally fascinated that someone could be kind of bringing in those sorts of incredible musical elements into a very straight ahead bluegrass tradition. And it wasn't newgrass. Like I was also listening to like Strength in Numbers and stuff like that. And so I kind of understood that there is a thing as newgrass and you can expand those boundaries. But, Clarence was bringing this openness. And I would just say it's a musical genius that is, found in, some of the best jazz players, and he was bringing that into the bluegrass context. And I think I was really fascinated in that point. And that, it just hit me at a time in my musical development where that's what I was really interested in, like the combination of traditional bluegrass and then like, I really wanted to be able to play jazz, I wanted to be able to play over changes and understand what was going on with modulations and all that and become an improviser. And I couldn't do it yet, but I was listening. So in Clarence, embodied all of these things that I really liked about those other kinds of music in the bluegrass context, and it just really stuck with me.
And that's really interesting, that that point about jazz, because there's two things that throws up. Is one, at the point that Clarence was doing all this, you didn't have the half a century of bluegrass guitar licks that we now hear and everybody's playing, because everybody's heard Doc, everybody's heard Tony, and it was a slightly different time for just absorbing bluegrass licks. Right.
Well, Clarence he didn't have much to go on in terms of guitar. I mean, there was Don Reno played some, great lead guitar stuff. Clarence grew up around Joe Mathis and Merle Travis. They were both out in California, but they were not bluegrass. They were kind of, country and rockabilly and swing. But yeah, there was very little bluegrass guitar to go on. But I think that's, for me, one of the things that makes Clarence's playing so interesting is that you can tell that he wasn't necessarily listening to guitarists. He was listening to definitely banjo players. Like, I think Earl Scruggs was probably his biggest influence. But he was also listening to, Django, clearly. Django's a guitar player, but not a bluegrass musician at all. And then Clarence was listening to fiddle players. Certainly his playing really kind of took some steps forward when Scotty Stoneman came out to LA and played with the Colonels. And Scotty was just, a fantastic player and improviser and just this incendiary stage presence. And I think that kind of pushed Clarence along. But I mean, that's one of the things that I like about guitar in general, is that the guitar is pretty good at, you can bring in elements of all the other instruments, not necessarily guitar. I mean, I personally like to play a lot of Monroe mandolin style stuff on guitar. And I like to cross pick, try to in a Scruggs style. I like to play fiddle lines and try to get fiddle shuffle. One of my favorite musicians is Tex Logan, the fiddler, and I really think about Tex's pulsation on the fiddle when I play guitar. So I'm very rarely thinking about guitar players. and Clarence was I think the same. And for Clarence, it was because there were none. He heard Doc Watson early on, but Clarence was already playing lead by the time Doc came out to California. So I think Clarence's style developed independently of Doc's, but then, there was definitely some influence there. He played Doc's, Beaumont Rag. He called it Julius Finkpine's Rag, but, stuff like that. And Black Mountain Rag. He played those things, but he was clearly on a path, to be a lead guitar player before Doc was in the picture. So yeah, he was listening so much to other instruments. And, when you talk about Scruggs, the banjo is the ultimate syncopated instrument, because all those 3-note rolls against 4/4. And so Clarence really internalized that, both not even just when he was doing cross picking, but his lines would be very angular and like accent at kind of a similar place that a banjo player's lines would accent, which is, stuff is crazy, especially if you try to like take it out off of the banjo and onto another instrument. It's really special. So.
Yeah. And the other point, just that sort of jazz influence, is that idea of playing over the changes, but there's that sort of old joke about how do you make an old jazz guy happy, like occasionally quote the melody. And you get that, like you were saying with Clarence's playing, is that if you wandered in the middle of a song and he was taking the solo, you'd probably be able to work out what the tune was. And with a lot of guitar players, as soon as the solo starts, they're checking in all sorts of stuff, and you wouldn't necessarily know which song it was. Right. And that's quite a strong element of Clarence's playing.
Yeah, very, very much so. This combination of, you can really kind of hear that he was holding the melody in his mind, even when he was playing something else. But, and that combined with just this playfulness, this inventiveness, this willing, and that was, I think, something that kind of comes from jazz improvisers, just this quest of like free expression with the instrument, of being, expressing something in the moment that's kind of, unique and of the essence. And you really feel that in Clarence's playing, that he's really has this kind of feeling of that he's exploring. And that holds true. Now, when I first listened to Clarence, or for a long time when I listened to Clarence, I'd hear his playing and like, well, wow, that sounds improvised. I'm sure that's improvised. But then I started hearing a lot more live recordings, bootlegs and whatnot, and you hear a lot of the same, melodic devices and rhythmic devices over again. So clearly he's like kind of working with some of the same stuff over and over again. He's maybe just implementing it in a little different way here and there. So it's not like he's not reinventing the wheel, but he's expressing it. Even when he's playing a lick or a phrase that he's played before, he plays it with this remarkable freshness, and it's like so in the moment. And it's coming out of this idea of playfulness, that is playful, he's just delighting himself, it sounds like, with like the way he messes around with rhythm, and he seems to be delighting himself with the way he's interacting with the other musicians in the moment, that he's playing off the other musicians, and that just sense of delight and playfulness, I think, is just really, really fascinating to me. And that's I think in the category of influence, that's something that I think tried to draw on, certainly in I think some of my better musical collaborations, like, with Chris Thiele and something that was like, there's kind of a similar, commitment to just kind of responding in the moment to whatever the other one does. And I think Clarence is all about that. And that I think made an impression on me early on.
It's funny, as soon as you were talking about playfulness there, it put me in mind of, there's a version of If I Should Wander Back Tonight that's on that record you did with Chris. And the solos, both the mandolin solos and the guitar solos on that track, are some of my favourite solos on anything ever. And because they are exactly as you say, they're sort of playful, taking an energy, and just like, the first time I heard that record, I remember laughing out loud at one point in one of the breaks, just as a kind of, they went there, brilliant. And there's and some of it's rhythm, some of it's the energy, some of it's the note choice, but it's like I can hear you both smiling as you play it, because it sounds like it's fun.
Oh yeah, it is fun and surprising. And Chris is one of the quickest musical thinkers that I've ever worked with. I mean, he's fast on the mandolin, but I mean, his mind works fast. And it's like, if I'm thinking about doing something, he's almost like sniffed that out in advance, and he's like, he's on it, he's ready to respond to it, almost like I'm thinking it, and he's like, he's there with it. So there's the certain kind of delight of just having that sort of spontaneous musical conversation, and you know, the musicians with that sort of ability to like process things in the moment that quickly and respond, you know, is so rare. And I get that feeling from Clarence too.
And there's that word conversation you just used, and like I've mentioned this before in other conversations with people, the idea that improvising is a conversation both with the tune and with the people you're playing with. And so that thought that you have, like, maybe when you're a younger musician or a less experienced musician, you presume improvisation is just completely making things up on the spot. And actually, it's like a spoken conversation in that if you've got a wide vocabulary and a command of language and you've had a lot of conversations, you can, like, most of what I say to you is going to be phrases that anybody else would, but occasionally you find a way of phrasing something and you go, oh, I like that. And so you use it again and you drop it in whether it's relevant. And it's just, you're not completely making words up as you go along, but you're using what you know and your collected vocabulary that pleases you, and then see where it fits in the moment. Right. And with, Clarence, the way he engages with the tune that he's playing over, again, I think is very much like what is expected of any jazz musician. In jazz music, typically, like, someone plays the head or the melody to the song once, and then this is a jumping off point for improvisation, and you might not hear the melody other than like maybe in little quotes here and there. But the part of the discipline of playing jazz well, is certainly in an ensemble, is that everyone in the ensemble knows exactly where you are in relation to that template of the song. You know exactly what the melody note is, what the chord is. And so, and that like the ghost of the song is strongly shared amongst whoever's playing. So, and then they might play things, they might like lay over polyrhythms or play, do chord substitutions or play, some inventive stuff that's not the melody. But even when it's not the melody is very much there, internalized. And that, I think it really feels like that. It was very much like that for Clarence, when he was playing around and like, he would play with rhythm. He'd play these things that were like so out of time. And it's like sounded like things were falling down. He's like falling down the stairs, but then he lands on his feet. And like at the end of it, you realize that he knew exactly where he was all along. That sort of deep internalization of what he's playing over, of the time and of the song that he's playing over, is really clear to me in Clarence's playing, that even when he's playing something different, he knows exactly where he is. And I would say no one plays around, at least in the bluegrass world, plays around with time like Clarence did. The way he would, he'd like start overlaying triplets. He'd do like quintuplets. He would play something that seemed like it was totally out of time for a moment, but then all of a sudden it was like right back. He would like find some downbeat and just land on it definitively. And like, he knew what was going on all along, and he was just kind of fooling us. And so that, I think that level of internalization of the music that one is playing is so rare. And, in bluegrass music, I think it's people who improvise, who like take breaks, rather that are not necessarily like playing the scripted melody. It's so rare, but Clarence had it in spades, and that's always drawn me in. And it's interesting because you were saying, I think you were 15 when you first heard that Appalachian Swing record, and Clarence wasn't that much older than that when he recorded it. Like, I think he was 18 when that record was made, which is totally amazing. I had the opportunity to talk to Roland White, his brother, about recording that. And one of the things about Appalachian Swing, especially if you listen to like a track like their 9 Pound Hammer, they're weaving in and out of each other's melodies. So like Roland will be playing a melody that he's like taking the lead, but then Clarence is like behind him. He's like playing this whole other solo, and he's like actually playing something very similar to the solo he's about to play when it's his turn. But like somehow it fits together. It doesn't feel like
what Clarence is playing is like interrupting Roland. It's almost like great Dixieland jazz when you have like multiple melodies kind of weaving in and out in real time. And it's totally improbable that they're able to pull this off. And, I asked Roland, like, did you ever rehearse that stuff or think about like how that was going to go together? And he's like, no, we just did it. Like, I don't know, maybe when I talked to him, asking him about that, there was some cognitive decline going. So it may be that there used to be more of a story there, but he sounded pretty sure that no, we didn't work this out. It just happened, that brotherly mind meld. And
that requires a proper two-way bit of listening, doesn't it? Because otherwise that's just one of you imposing something on somebody else and just walking all over their territory. And so many people do that, and they just play, and it sounds like they're playing over other people, but there's not a hint of that,
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, like, and then like something like Listen to the Mockingbird, that Roland's playing a melody, and then Clarence is in the back going. And so like that, I mean, that's crazy. Like if someone tried to play that like while I was soloing, I'm like, what are you doing, man? That's so rude. But then you hear how they do it, and it all fits. And chalk it up to them just having played music all their lives, together, and but it does reflect an internalization that I think all musicians are seeking on one level or another. Like when you play music, you have to, to learn whatever you're doing, you have to kind of think it through, you have to puzzle it out. But like where you always want it to get is to that level of being unconscious and fully internalized, and so that you can execute things are on the fly, that you're not like having to overthink. And I always get the feeling, of hearing them play. It's like that with a lot of brother duets, but I think, you rarely get that instrumentally the way that you got with Clarence and Roland.
Yeah, it's often the vocal side of that
right.
People talk about.
Yeah, they're singers that. Yeah, I mean, you hear like the Monroe brothers, or the Louvin brothers, or the Stanleys. You get like things are just kind of coming together. Kind of on the fly, just out of that deep internalization. But yeah, it's really rare on the instrumental side. So that's always really appealed to me about their music. And you got to credit Roland. Now we're talking about Clarence, but you wouldn't have Clarence without Roland, because Roland was older, like 7 or 8 years older, I think. And so when Clarence was 5, and wanted to play the guitar, evidently, Clarence was always small, but like, especially at age 5. And so like, he couldn't actually get both arms around the guitar. So they'd switch off, like one would fret and the other would strum, and then they'd switch. And so like, and Roland was already playing. So like Clarence grew up, Clarence never knew life without Roland there playing music. So it's I don't think you wouldn't have gotten that sort of depth of development in Clarence if not for Roland, just being there and just always, supplying music. And then, just the way they played together and supported one another. Like I was, I love Clarence's playing with, the Byrds and with Mule Skinner. But it's the best stuff is always with Roland, when he's playing off of Roland, when he's reacting to, being supported by Roland.
Yeah,
those are the peaks.
There's that video that's on YouTube of the sort of masterclass with, is it Bob Baxter, who's sort of interviewing him, and they play a couple of tunes together, and then Roland comes out and plays with them, and it just all kind of lifts off slightly. Yeah. Well, yeah. I think the interviewer there seems very like nervous about interview. Like he seemed like he's sort of intimidated by like, I'm interviewing my hero and I don't know how to handle myself, basically. So I think I think he seemed to respond by kind of focusing a lot of what was going on himself, probably out of just a nervousness. I mean, gosh, yeah.
If I had to interview and back up Clarence White, I'd be probably freaked out too. But it's a weird dynamic. But then when Roland shows up, it's like it's Clarence doing his thing. And
yeah, it's cool to get to see it. And you've kind of done a deep dive on a couple of the records and taught them in classes.
Yep.
And did you was that part of that, was that to do a deep dive into it for yourself, or had you sort of discovered some stuff that you hadn't heard before by doing that and sort of wanted to teach it, or how did that come about?
Well, that all came about during the pandemic, where I had previously been teaching a lot of in-person guitar classes in addition to private lessons, but I would do group classes in New York, and there'd be kind of an intro class, and then we'd do one kind of on brother duets, but like it was it wasn't like too specific, because I just have to make it be not so specific that no one will sign up. But once during the pandemic, when all the teaching went online, I realized, wow, I can use this opportunity. I can connect with anyone all over the world. So if I want to teach on Manzanita or Appalachian Swing, I can find people in Australia and Finland and whatnot who want to like do that deep dive. And I'm like, maybe this is the time. Now, I had avoided really learning any Clarence White music, despite him being my favorite guitarist since I was 15, despite him probably being the primary, the most influential or inspiring. We talk about it, most inspiring guitarist to me. Like I'd always heard it and be like, yeah, I could learn it, but like I could never really learn it. Just out of respect, just for the uniqueness of his timing and touch and all that. I'm like, I'd rather just like leave that something that I just listen to and let it wash over me, and don't try to analyze. But after however many decades of that, I'm like, you know what? I've had however many decades of just letting it wash over me. I think I feel like I can, dive into this, and that there would be some benefit, because yes, we're never going to get his sense of timing when we try to play that music, but there is so much about, again, his phrasing, his note choice, his rhythm style that could be really beneficial and is really unique. And so I decided that was the time to dive into it. And so I taught a whole 6-week Zoom class on Appalachian Swing, and, did a lot of transcriptions of his lead and rhythm. And that was a sort of a revelation to me to get in there and realize, what he was actually doing, which was just, so subtle and so crazy. And honestly, another factor is that I feel like, Tony Rice has been like the dominant guitar player of the last 40 years, and, for good reason. And I'm sure you're exploring the connection between Clarence and Tony, and how, Tony idolized Clarence and, tried in vain to play like Clarence, but realized he couldn't early on and ended up sounding like Tony Rice. And so that's pretty cool. And that they met when like Tony was 9, Clarence was 15 or something like that. I think, it's a very cool connection. And then there's the guitar and all that. But since Clarence died so young and hadn't like made definitive recordings like Doc Watson and Tony Rice and Norman Blake all have, I think, finding the really good Clarence stuff has been a little challenging. And even Appalachian Swing like was out of print for a lot of years. And, I think some of the versions that were available were like sonically not good, but then a little while ago, there was like a 40th anniversary reissue that actually sounds really good. It was sold on Sierra, which is this independent label. And any point being is it's not like widely known. And, I really want to share actual Clarence with people. Because I think a lot of times people's understanding and idea of Clarence and what he's about is filtered through Tony, because people pay so much attention to Tony, and Tony's had a lot of instructional material, and he'll be like, oh, here, this is a Clarence lick. And he's played like, oh God, now I know what a Clarence lick is. But it's not the same when you hear Clarence play it. So I think there's a real lack of, common knowledge and access to what Clarence was really about. And I just thought that would be a good thing to share. Once I got over the hurdle of the willingness to transcribe it, I know I have the skills to actually transcribe it. And was able to do some detailed transcriptions, which I know Russ did back in the 70s. But honestly, we have better digital tools now. It's like I can, and a really good set of headphones. So like there are some technological advantages to transcribing that stuff now compared to in the 70s, which I think he was doing that from a tape recorder, maybe at half speed or something. But I thought it was maybe a fresh look. And also I wanted to really explore Clarence's rhythm playing, which was, extravagant. And like Tony is kind of like the main event in a way, like Tony Rice never played a lead. He would still be, one of the greatest guitar players ever to live, just on the basis of his rhythm playing. And I think Clarence is like that too. I mean, Clarence is great lead player, but I don't know if David shared with you the story of Clarence, or David's dad saying, "Hey, Clarence, man, your leads are really coming along." Did he talk about that?
Yeah, so Clarence sort of said, "Yeah, it's okay, but I put my rhythm playing up against anybody's."
Yep.
That sort of, yeah.
Yep. And I think that's exactly right. So,
and I think that's great because as guitarists, like 95% of what we do is play rhythm. And yet,
right.
when I did the Tony Rice interviews, like pretty much everybody I spoke to, whether it was like Bob Minner or Chris Eldridge or whoever, they all said, "I love Tony's lead playing, but if I was forced to choose, I would take the rhythm playing every day." And it's
right. Yeah, it's really a special skill, and it's kind of it's more felt than heard. I think one of the best guitar players working today is Del McCoury, and how many leads does Del McCoury take?
Yeah, and it is that thing that often in a band context the guitar gets lost, which is why it's why I love records like Church Street Blues or the record you do with Chris Thiele or Skaggs and Rice, or where you can actually hear what the guitar's doing. And actually, that mix for the Live in Sweden record with the New Kentucky Colonels, you can actually hear the guitar pretty loud. It doesn't get lost, and you can hear Clarence really well.
It was recorded by someone who was there for Clarence. Yeah, so it's prominent. Also, with the Appalachian Swing recording, that one's really good to listen to for rhythm guitar because it was recorded to 3-track style. So like old Beatles recordings, where you have like the drums like all on one channel. Like old solo recordings where you have like the rhythm, the horn sections on one side and the drums on the other side. So that recording is like that, where Clarence is panned all the way to the right channel, Roland is panned all the way to the left channel. So you have full stereo separation between them, and the bass and the banjo is up the middle.
You can just pop out an earbud and listen to what you want.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, definitely recommend find like the good the reissue, the remastering of Appalachian Swing, because it was done really well. They went back to the original 3-track tapes and just made a really hi-fi transfer of it, and it's gorgeous.
And that sort of thing you were saying about really wanting to put Clarence in front of people, like that's kind of the journey I'm on with this. Really, is because Doc Watson turned 100 earlier this year, I spent a lot of time talking about Doc, and then with the Church Street Blues stuff, I spent a lot of time talking about Tony. And it's like it sort of came out of a bit of a curiosity of there's so many conversations about Clarence, but like you say, he wasn't around for long enough to really put out those definitive recordings and to be here to talk about any of it. And so I was curious to find out more about this sort of figure and his influence, because his influence is huge.
Influence is huge without people like knowing all that much about what he was actually doing. So it's, I think that's great. Thank you for putting the story out there and highlighting just really one of, I think, just the great musicians of the 20th century. I think not just in bluegrass, he's just such a natural and so expressive, so original, and such a master of timing. Like just absurd.
And that's one of the things that like when I first got into bluegrass guitar, you hear the flashy stuff and you think, oh, that's brilliant. And then I think it was when I first heard Russ Barenberg, and you realised that just a bit of variety of the melody, whether you place the note differently or change one thing or just turn something a tiny bit from where it was. Yeah. There's a whole world of improvising that is just playing around with the source material that's not going too far from it. And, and hearing Clarence, it might be a busier version of that, and he's cross-picking and he's choosing where to place those beats to drag your ear away far enough that he can then bring you right back. But it's that that just playing with the material. It's almost so exciting to listen to, I think.
Another guitarist I would add to that conversation would be Larry Sparks, who's, not the flashiest guitar player, but just totally unique, very sparse. And he's always playing the song, not always literally the melody, but he's another one who's always fully internalized the song. And when he plays a guitar break, you know what song it's over. And not a lot of hot licks, but it's some of the best stuff there is. So I think Clarence and Larry might be my two favorite bluegrass guitar players for those reasons.
And this is like just purely a conversation framed about Clarence's flat picking. There's a whole other world of Telecaster playing and B-benders and innovation, and just beautiful playing on some of those Birds records. And there's a whole, if you took his lead playing and his flat picking and his rhythm playing out of it, he still had this huge influence in a whole other world in a very short life.
Yeah, he invented multiple styles, and you can say that about Bill Monroe. I mean, he invented bluegrass, but it's kind of he's also in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, I think for good reason.
Yeah.
But yeah, Clarence, inventive in at least two directions, and who knows, that's part of the compelling and tragic thing about it is who knows what he would have done, because he was about to embark on a solo career and had just started on a record that, the tracks that had been released that weren't finished. So we don't really know what his vision was for those,
Yeah.
Could have been a flop, but, he could have had a whole new vision,
we never got to find out. And that's the real shame, isn't it? Is who knows what the last sort of 50 years could have produced.
Totally. Yeah. And, his, Telecaster playing and the B-bending aside, just Clarence was really there on the ground floor of the whole kind of country rock, cosmic American thing. He and Graham Parsons gets a lot of the credit for being the trailblazer, but Clarence and Graham were, they were, they worked together. And I think Clarence, at least he had as much to do with kind of bringing those styles and those worldviews together as Graham Parsons did. So add that to the list of contributions.
And that was my chat with Michael Daves. Next up is Tim Stafford to round this off. A lovely sort of thoughtful chat about Clarence with Tim. Always enjoy talking to Tim about anything, but particularly about guitar, because that's he knows so much of this stuff, and his insight and his sort of take on it is always fascinating. Tim plays a bit of guitar in this, which I didn't know he was going to do, and generally all these interviews are set up with a mic for the voice. We don't set up a separate instrument mic because people tend not to play, but every now and again people want to just illustrate something, and Tim did. And because the mic was set up for vocals, it doesn't pick the guitar up particularly well, but I've left it in because I think it's really interesting, and I think it's very useful to hear, even though it's not the most high fidelity or whatever. So I've left that in, as I did with the Michael Daves one you just heard. There's some bits in there as well. But yes, this is the final bit of this. I hope you've enjoyed these two. Here comes Tim Stafford.
I think the first time I heard Clarence was a random radio cut from Appalachian Swing, which would have been in about 10 years after it was recorded. It came out in 64, I think. And so it would have been about 74. And it was another kind of a thing like Tony. When I heard it, I was like, is this a guitar? And it was just a man on a guitar doing these duets on. One of them was 9 Pound Hammer, and I thought, God, I've heard this song a lot, but not played like this cat on a guitar. I mean, what is he doing there? And to this day, I go back and listen to that version of that song, and I'm like, and John Henry is another one, played out of C position, And I'm like, how in the world did you come up with this style, And I've read a lot about Clarence's style and how he he developed it. And I'm thinking of the time in California when they were kids and they were playing with Joe Maphis. And evidently Joe was a big influence on Clarence and how to hold the pick, how to play fast, and also things like that 3-finger G chord, that everybody plays in bluegrass now. I think Clarence is the one who popularized that for bluegrass players. Joe was the one that showed it to him. And I think Marty Stewart may have mentioned that. And now, since Tony did it, following Clarence, it's made its way into bluegrass proper, But you listen to Clarence play something like John Henry, and this stuff is just, it's like the timing of it, and I'm listening to it, I'm like, how do you start by syncopating so many notes like that? Most people start the opposite place, and it's like Clarence's immediate inclination was, I'm going to start syncopating right away, This stuff is just, it still blows my mind to hear it, and that's my approximation of Clarence. I never learned that stuff note for note like a lot of these guys did, but golly, and I love, like he did Footprints in the Snow. That's just got this lilting feel to it that just encapsulates the lyric. And when I heard that on that Muleskin record, I was like, oh my gosh, man, this is so amazing. And I know when we started, the Boys in the Band was a band I played with in East Tennessee back in the 70s, and with Barry Bells and Adam Steffi. And we all three joined Allison's band. We were in a group called Dusty Miller in between. But when we traveled around, man, we had a live Clarence, a group of live Clarence recordings. We listened to that stuff nonstop. And just, there was one collection that came out on Rounder that we listened to a lot. The one that had When You're Smiling and a few other things like that. And he was one of those guys, man, that he could channel Django and he could channel Doc Watson, and it still came out Clarence. It's like he had no limit to what he could do, and he proved that when he picked up a Telecaster and put that B-bender on it, and just blew the whole rock and roll world away when he did that. I mean, there's still legendary stories about them playing these outdoor rock festivals, and the front row, all of these guitar players would jam up and just actually, make a mosh pit, just trying to look at what he was doing with that B-bender, and how that worked and how he played. And I don't know, to me, the older I get, the more amazing Clarence's playing gets to me. And obviously everybody loves Tony's playing, and it's still ground zero for me. But I also know what Clarence meant to Tony, so there's that. So.
It's funny that little kickoff you just played when you picked up your guitar there. Those first few notes of that 9-pound hammer, and you can draw a line between that and Church Street Blues, and you can hear, what connects the two. And if you didn't know Tony was influenced by Clarence and somebody played you those two things, you go, oh, what, and yet they're totally different as well.
Totally. And the guy that really, though, is such a connecting force in all that is Doc Watson, because Clarence admits that, after he heard Doc, his playing changed completely. And Tony mentions in the book, first time he heard that one record of Doc's Vanguard record, he said it was like God had come down and was hitting a chord on a D28. He made a huge impact on Tony too. Doc did. So, but I got a feeling that Clarence was already playing some stuff before that too, that it just caused him to focus what he was doing in a different direction. And it caused him to play things that he didn't before. And, I definitely hear Doc licks in Appalachian Swing, when he does John Henry, I hear all those licks. That's he even does that in rhythm when he's playing behind Roland's leads, when they're doing duets, Yeah, so it's really bizarre to hear that stuff, but it's obvious where it came from. It's a Doc thing, But still, yeah, man, like I said, anytime he did anybody, it came out Clarence when he played. And I don't think people saw Clarence enough to realize that Tony's playing was so dependent on it, and it really from the right hand technique. And the left hand, too. He evidently played the same way Tony did with that fulcrum tonic kind of thing, where he put the thumb on the back of the neck of the guitar like a classical player. And then his right hand very much played with the thumb the way Tony did as well, rather than back and forth like the rest of us try to do, flopping around.
And as you're talking about, like, everything came out Clarence, it's extraordinary how, like, that Appalachian Swing record, like how young he was, and yet such a fully formed musical personality.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, of course, he'd been playing since he was like, 3 or 4. I mean, he was very young when they put a guitar in his hands. If you got a chance to read Bob Black's book on Roland, it's called Mandolin Man. There's a lot of recollection about the early history of the brothers and what their family was like. When he remembers the exact day that Clarence walked through the house and happened to see Roland playing for the first time, and it hit him. And he stood there and stared at him. And he said, "Here, play yourself," and he handed him a guitar. What's this, I mean, stuff like that is so cool in that book. But, I don't know, they just sort of grew up together and they influenced each other. There's no doubt in my mind that Roland's playing really influenced Clarence. And he was the older brother. And there was something about his approach, too, that helped crystallize that thing in Roland, in Clarence's head, that said, mess around with the time when you get a chance. Play the syncopation. Make people wonder what you're doing there. Because Roland did that too, Roland was a very underrated musician. He was a great mandolin player. Just he had his own style too, and it's kind of like Clarence playing the mandolin. When you hear Roland play, especially on some of those things. But yeah, I think Clarence was what was he, 18 when or 19 when they did Appalachian Swing. That's just mind blowing. It really is. It's just to consider what he did that was so creative and such a unique style to be created at that age.
So such a relatively short career to fit so much into, in terms of like such a strong style of flat picking, and all the innovation on the electric guitar ended up being
29.
Like the second longest serving member of the Byrds after Roger McGuinn. And
That's crazy. He was 29 when he died. I mean, you talk about packing a lot into a short life and just really tragically cut short. You always wonder what he would have done if that hadn't happened. If he hadn't gotten killed so tragically so young, that who knows what he would have accomplished, It's just really, really hard to say. But when I think of complete guitar player, I think of Clarence White. I don't think anybody's ever approached it. His complete mastery of the instrument in so many different styles. Just he was so good at whatever he did, and he was so good that people just didn't realize how good he was. I mean, everybody thought he was great, but they didn't. We're still just figuring out how great Clarence White is.
And that's it. That's the end of our tribute to Clarence White. I hope you've enjoyed this. There's so much more we could have chatted about. We didn't really get into his electric playing, his time with the Byrds. That is also a whole other, you could spend 3 hours talking about that. But thanks to all my guests. Thanks to everybody who's taken part in these. I really hope you've enjoyed them. I know I say this all the time, but I'm going to say it again. I get so much out of doing these longer form, multi-guest sort of deep dives. And there's some more of these to come. I'm working on a couple of things for the end of this year and early next year. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed these. Thanks for listening if you've made it this far. I will see you next time with some more Bluegrass chat. Have a great week and happy picking. Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.